Welcome back. Hopefully by this point you have finished your virtual lab. If you have not yet done so, go ahead and paste this diagram into your notes. We are going to label the steps of the lytic cycle on there. Go ahead and pause the video if you need to, and then come on back. All right, so in the lytic cycle, we're going to take a look at it with the bacteriophage, infecting a bacteria. All right, so in the first step of our lytic cycle, the virus attaches to the host cell. So our first step is attachment. And the virus does this using the glycoprotein spikes on the outside of the virus to recognize and latch onto the host cell. After it's attached, the virus inserts or injects its genetic material into the cell. Once that genetic material is inside the cell, the genetic material is used by the cell's ribosomes to make something called a restriction enzyme. Those restriction enzymes then digest or chop up the host cell's DNA. Now, why would a virus want to do this? There's a couple of reasons. One is that it frees up nucleotides for the virus to use in its own DNA and RNA. Right? The second reason is a little bit more metaphorical, we'll go with. Imagine that you were trying to take over a country. The first thing you would probably do is go in and assassinate the leader. Okay, it's the same thing with a virus. If the virus goes in and takes out the host cell's DNA, the host cell now has to focus all of its energy and ribosomes and proteins on doing what the virus wants to do. It has none of its own directions anymore. And so by digesting the host cell's DNA, the virus makes sure that the virus, has full control of the cell. Right? Once the host cell DNA has been digested, the virus then begins to copy its own genetic material. Right? So we make more virus genetic material. And once we have more virus genetic material, now the enzymes and the ribosomes have that genetic material so they can start the process of transcription and translation and make more virus proteins. And capsids. And then once we have those viral proteins and capsids, those viruses assemble. And they do this spontaneously. The cell doesn't need machinery to put them together. The virus, capsids, and nucleic acid just come together. And then once those viruses are assembled, they come out of the host cell. And then they move on to go infect more host cells. All right, and the cycle starts all over again. Now, this cycle is called the lytic cycle because the word lys means to burst, and lytic means having to do with bursting. And oftentimes at the end of the lytic cycle, the virus will burst the host cell's membrane. Okay. Another thing to know about our lytic viruses is they typically have a fairly rapid onset of symptoms because the virus is taking over the host cell right away. An example of a lytic virus is something like the cold or the flu. But the lytic virus isn't our only option for cellular reproduction. All right, we're going to now take a look at the lysogenic cycle. All right, and the lysogenic cycle is kind of like a detour in the middle of the lytic cycle. All right, so the lysogenic cycle starts the same way. It starts with the virus attaching and inserting its genetic material. But then it takes this detour, and after the genetic material is inserted into the host, the viral DNA actually becomes part of the host DNA. All right, and then once that viral DNA is hidden inside the host DNA, when the host cell replicates, it replicates the viral DNA with it. Now, these host cells can go on replicating with the viral DNA inside for weeks to months to even decades. All right, and the advantage to this for a lysogenic virus is that if the DNA is hidden inside the host cell, your body's immune system is not going to see it. And so the virus can create more copies of its own DNA without your body being able to see and attack it. And so it can infiltrate more of your host cells. All right, and then eventually what happens after those host cells have replicated, something triggers the viral DNA to come out of the host cell DNA. And then we re-enter the other steps of the lytic cycle. So the viral DNA comes out. It creates restriction enzymes to digest the host cell DNA. All right, it creates more viral genetic material, makes more virus proteins. The viruses assemble, exit the host cell, and go to infect more cells. Okay, so we can see that this lysogenic cycle is basically a detour that can take months to years that allows the virus to reproduce without being seen. And so an example of a lysogenic cycle virus that doesn't have immediate symptoms is something like HIV. And we'll talk more about some differences between lysogenic and lytic viruses towards the end of this video. All right, so now let's think about exiting the host cell. There are actually a couple of ways to exit the host cell. All right, these are our bacteriophages on the outside of our bacterial cell. And if you look, the bacterial cell's membrane has ruptured. So just as a reminder, the word lyse means to burst. And so oftentimes the host or the viruses will burst out of the host cell. But this is not the only option. All right, a cell can also do something called budding. So right now I am outlining the membrane of the host cell. And if you'll notice, the membrane is actually surrounding these new viruses that are coming out of it, right? So this process is called budding. And in budding, the virus comes out of the cell using reverse endocytosis and it takes part of the host cell membrane with it. All right, this part of the host cell membrane that comes with it is what becomes the envelope that we talked about earlier. And the advantage to a virus to stealing its host cell's membrane is that now it's camouflaged. It looks like your body's own cells. And so again, your body will not attack it if it looks like one of your own body cells. So this is another way that viruses can sneak around in your body and not be detected. All right, so now let's take a moment and talk about some lytic human viral diseases. Remember, these are the ones typically with rapid onset symptoms. Even though these symptoms could last for our victim's whole life, okay? But whatever the case, they have a rapid onset, okay? So some of the ones that we have, all right? Measles is a lytic cycle virus, as is mumps. And you do need to know these diseases, so you should be taking notes on these. Rubella, also known as German measles, is another type of lytic viral human disease. Again, all rapid onset. These are ones that we don't typically see as much lately because our vaccines are usually pretty good for them. All right. We also have things like the flu, and there's lots of different kinds of flu. And the common cold is another common virus that is a lytic cycle virus. All right. But again, these viruses can have pretty devastating effects as well. We have things like Ebola that can infect humans, smallpox, which has been eradicated, but used to be a very severe disease, all right? Things like norovirus, which causes violent vomiting and diarrhea. You also have things like yellow fever, dengue fever, Zika, and West Nile, which are all transmitted by mosquitoes. All right. You can also have things like polio. That's one of those ones that has long-lasting symptoms, typically paralysis, and sometimes deformities, but usually paralysis that can last a lifetime, even though it's a short-term illness, as well as rabies. All right, so now let's pause for a second and think about which ones of these we have vaccines for. And the ones we have vaccines for, I'm going to mark in red. So we do have vaccines for measles, mumps, and rubella. We have vaccines for some kinds of the flu. We have vaccines for smallpox. We're working on a vaccine for Ebola, but we haven't quite gotten there yet. Let's see, we have a yellow fever vaccine. They're working on a Zika vaccine. We have a polio vaccine and a rabies vaccine. But some of these other ones we typically do not have vaccines for, right? So those are our lytic cycle viruses. Now let's take a look at some of these lysogenic cycle viruses. All right, so remember, lysogenic viruses typically have later onset symptoms. Or they can appear and then go dormant for a while. And they can be reoccurring. So what are some common ones of those? One that is a recurring lysogenic virus is HIV. Right? HIV inserts itself into your host cell's DNA. You can also have hepatitis. Hepatitis causes liver inflammation and liver disease. Herpes, which there's different kinds of herpes viruses. One that is actually pretty common is the one that causes cold sores. If you've ever had a cold sore, the virus's DNA is hiding out inside the cells around your mouth. Right? When your immune system is suppressed, like when you have a cold, that DNA comes out, the virus starts to replicate, and that's how it gets passed on. Another lysogenic virus is HPV. Now you'll notice that most of these, if we take a look between this slide and our previous slide with lytic viruses, you'll notice that almost all of our STDs are going to be lysogenic viruses. And that's because we are often asymptomatic, meaning we don't show symptoms for lysogenic viruses, but we can still be infectious when we have them, all right? You're probably not going to be sexually active if you have a virus that you know is going to infect someone, but these lysogenic ones you have and you're not aware of it, and so you do end up passing them on, all right? Now, there are some viruses that can do both. One of those is chickenpox. So this is our chickenpox virus, or our varicella zoster virus. And in children, it causes chickenpox. Most people don't get chickenpox anymore because we have vaccines, all right? This is what chickenpox used to look like. It caused an all-over rash, fever. It was not that severe of a disease, right? Chickenpox is a lytic cycle virus. However, once the chickenpox has been beaten back by your immune system, the viruses actually crawl up your nerves and hang out near your spinal column, all right? So if you look in this diagram, you can see the virus is hanging out in one of your nerves that is attached to your spinal column. As you get older, if your immune system is suppressed, what happens is these viruses come back out those nerves and create a very painful blistery rash known as shingles. And shingles is the lysogenic version of this virus. It's actually much more painful than chickenpox, all right? So chickenpox / shingles is a virus that can be both lytic and lysogenic. All right, so now let's talk about how our viral diseases spread. They can be they can be airborne. They can be left on surfaces. You can pick them up with skin contact. They can be passed through body fluids like vomit or blood. When we talk about sexual contact or sexually transmitted diseases, it's usually a combination of skin contact and body fluids. They can also be passed in contaminated food and water. They can also be transmitted by vectors. Vectors are animals, like mosquitoes, that carry a disease without getting the disease themselves. All right, and we're going to stop there so we can line up the next video on whether or not viruses are alive.